Hey guys, welcome to your first video on learning Python. In this video, we're going to be learning about the basics of Python. Before we start, let's talk about some history. Python was created by someone called Guido van Rossum in another language called C. So C is also another type of programming language, but that was used to create Python. He started work on it in 1989, and he continued to work on it all the way until 2018, when he stepped down as the head of the Python team in July the 12th. Python is like any other programming language, which means it's basically a set of instructions for the computer to carry out. If you take a look at the picture that I've included down here, you can see a bunch of different lines of code, all one after the other. All of these are different instructions for the computer that it's going to carry out from top to bottom. To start off, we're going to be learning how to store data inside of Python with something called variables. Now, if you looked at the picture that I included in the last slide, you could see a bunch of lines of code all one after the other. And all of those lines had a number that was associated next to it, which was basically the line number. So let me go back to the last slide to show you that. You can see the number starts from 24 up here, which means this line of instruction is on line 24. And these instructions go all the way from line 24 to line 42. What that means is all Python code is written into something called a file. A file is basically a blank sheet for you to write anything in it, and Python utilizes this to be able to store the instructions for the computer so it can run those instructions. But when you try to store values inside of just files, they don't actually get stored in the computer's memory. As soon as you close out of the file, that data is lost and you can't use it anymore. With Python, you can use something called variables to be able to store any data. Variables is basically certain keywords that you can associate with values inside of the computer's memory. And I'll show you guys in a second what I mean. So let's look at the code side of what variables are. So on the code side of Python, we can start by creating our first variable. So like I mentioned before, we have our file in front of us over here, and here's the numbers of each line, so 1, 2, 3, all the way until line 17, and we have our instructions that are written down over here. For now, anything in these hashtags or anything in these triple quotes will not be considered as instructions for the computer, because the computer does not recognize any of these lines that have either hashtag in front of them or triple quotes in front of them. Alright, let's create our first variable. We're going to name this variable var, and we're going to put the number 10 inside of there. Now we've created our variable called var, and we put the number 10 inside, and to simplify what's happening in the computer, in the memory space, the computer is taking the word var and putting it in a box that's attached to another one. So the name of the variable will be over there, while the contents will be in here. So essentially, when we create a variable like this, and again, this is just a simplified version of what happens, but what happens is that it will have two sort of boxes attached to each other, where one of the boxes will contain the name of the variable while the other one will contain the value of the variable. Now that we created our variable, let's go ahead and print it out to the console. So this set of instruction that I'm using here is a way for us to basically visualize what's happening inside of the code. This is a function called print, and it has parentheses around it, and inside the parentheses we give it what to print. What this instruction is going to do is it's going to go ahead and print our result on this side of the coding environment. So if I go ahead and press run, we get 10 printed out over here because var was a variable that held the value 10, and when we printed var, the computer went and looked at what value that variable held and printed that value out to the console. As well as that, you can also have different variables that store another variable. So we have a second variable called var2, which stores var itself. So if I go ahead and print both var2 and var, the result will be 10 and 10 again, because var2 holds var and var holds 10, which means var is also 10 as well as var2. So that's the basics of how to define a variable and how to use a variable. Now let's talk about the different values you can store inside of Python. So far, when we created our first variable var, we stored the value 10 in there. But 10 isn't the only thing we can store in there. We can also store decimals such as 2.2, or we can also store words in quotation marks. Let's say hello world. There you go. Now each of these values have a different name in Python. The number 10 represents an int, or short form for integer. If you guys remember anything from math class, you'll remember that numbers have different classification in math. They range from whole numbers to rational numbers to irrational numbers, etc. So just like that, if you remember what integer means in math, an integer is basically any number from negative infinity to positive infinity, including 0. So when we store anything from, I don't know, negative infinity, and I'll represent negative infinity as like, a really big negative number. So we'll say this is negative infinity. If you store anything from this to positive infinity, it's considered an integer to Python. So the next value we want to take a look at is 2.2. This value, according to Python, is classified as a float, which stands for floating point numbers. Now, I'm not too sure why they chose that specific name, because in math you would call this a decimal. But I'm guessing that the floating point comes from the fact that there's a point in between to make this entire number a decimal. So anything from negative infinity including decimals to positive infinity including decimals is a floating point number. Finally, the last one that I want to talk about is the word that we stored inside of this variable. So this word was surrounded by quotation marks, and you can see that it was highlighted in a different color. This word, according to Python, is classified as an str, or short form for string. Short form for string. Basically, it was called a string because a word is just a string of characters, so it's multiple characters put together to make a complete word or even a sentence. So whenever you're creating any strings or words, you have to put quotation marks around it, because if you don't, the computer will think that these words over here are different variables that it's trying to access. So if you remember, when I printed var up here, I didn't put any quotation marks around it because I want the computer to check for whether there's a variable called var and then get its value and print it out. If I put quotation marks around var, it would turn into a word. So if I go ahead and run this file, it just prints var for us. It does not print the number 10 or whatever we had stored inside of that variable before. It just prints the word var. So the difference between a string and just a word over here is the quotation marks, and the quotation marks lets you differentiate between it being just a word and it being a variable. Okay, now that we know how to define variables as well as store different values in it, let's go on to the next part of the basics of Python. So another useful feature Python has is the ability to do math inside of this file. So if I go ahead and print this, it gives us the value of 20. So if I print 10 plus 10, obviously it adds 10 and 10 together and gives us the result. And the same thing can be done with multiplication. So I have to do 10 asterisk 10. So the asterisk you can get by pressing Shift and 8. And let's go ahead and print 10 minus 10. And finally, let's do 10 divided by 10. And the division sign will be a forward slash. If I go ahead and run all of this, we can get all of our results over here. So the first one prints out 20, so 10 plus 10 is 20. That's correct. The next one prints out 10 times 10. 10 times 10 is 100, so that's correct. 10 minus 10 is 0, so that's also correct. And finally, it gives us 1, which is 10 divided by 10. So anything divided by itself is 1, so that's also correct. Now the math that we're doing is great and all, but we want to be able to do the math and store the calculations or store the results somewhere else as well. So what we can do is we can actually create a variable that actually holds an expression. Oh, whoops, not the plus, or not the equals to it. It needs to be a plus. So we're gonna create a new variable called var equals 10 plus 10. So it holds the expression. Now if I go ahead and print that, we can get the number 20 because 10 plus 10 evaluates to 20 and 20 is stored inside of var. And because it's stored inside of var, we can print var as many times as we want and we still get the same expression being printed over and over again. So we get 20 printed 3 times. But not only that, you can have as long an expression as you want. So we can go up till, we can just keep adding numbers. Let's just keep adding random numbers. If I go ahead and print this, it completely calculates the whole thing for us and gives us the result over here. So it looks like the result is 31,984. And another thing to remember is that Python also follows PEMDAS, so it follows the order of operation. So if I make a second variable called var2 and store 10 plus 10 minus 15 plus 36 times 84, and something like that. This one, if we're evaluating this expression according to PEMDAS, we would do the multiplication first, then the additions, so all of that, and then finally the subtraction at the end. So let's check. Let's delete these print values and print out var2. Let's check what comes out as the result. So we get 3,029 as the result of this expression over here. Okay. Lastly, I want to go over one more way to do math in Python. Let's create a variable called number1. So this is our first number, and we're going to store the number 10 in there. Then we're going to do number 2, so another variable called number 2, and we're going to store the value 15 in there. Okay, now what you can do is, let me delete these print statements. Now what you can do is we're going to do print number 1 plus number 2. So you can actually add the variables together. So this variable, remember, it doesn't have quotation marks around it, which means the computer is going to try to search for a variable called number 1. When it does, it's going to retrieve this value, so number 10. So 10 is going to be over here, and number 2 is going to get replaced by 15. So 10 plus 15, let's see what the result is. 25. That's correct. So 10 plus 15 is 25. And we just did it by adding the two variables that contain the values together. Okay, so those were the basics of Python. It was defining a variable, talking about what are the different types of values a variable can store, and doing a bit of math in Python. In the next video, you guys will be learning about conditionals in Python. is being stored inside of var. Oh my.
Are you free?
Wait, I'm recording a video right now. Alright, can you please cut that out? Okay.